on shifting. With dreams that linger just out of reach. We walk through shadows that keep on shifting.
Pause for a moment and imagine that unsettling feeling about the foundation of what you believe about the world suddenly start to shake. You realize that printing, for example, as well as literacy and standardized language, things you probably thought were neutral tools, are actually a powerful hidden system that quietly shapes far more of human behavior and society than we usually admit. Then comes an even deeper realization, which is, for example, digital language and coding is not some distant future development. It is already here. It is already operating. It is already rewriting the basic rules that govern how we think, how power works, and what is even possible in our lifetime. And finally, an insight that ties everything together. What could this possibly be? Well, the often overlooked psychology of communication and identity, which is a quiet connecting force between the two. And it may be the single most important factor shaping the future of knowledge, freedom, and human potential. As Donella Meadows wrote in her book Thinking in System, which was published in 2008, I am paraphrasing here by the way, we can't impose our will on a system. We can listen to what the system tells us and discover how its property and our values can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. Today's episode of Echoes of Change Culture in Flux, we are not just talking about three separate topics. We are stepping into a conversation about three living forces. Forces that most people only fully notice after the world around them has already changed, unfortunately. In the next 2 hours, more or less, we will carefully explore the intellectual landscape of, first of all, the hidden ways printing literacy as well as standardized language work beneath our everyday awareness, quietly shaping decision at both personal and societal level. And then we will continue with the next chapter, which will be about the reality of digital language and coding, not as a future possibility, but as an active transformation happening right now with surprising consequences for our freedom, truth, and shared future. And then today's episode will be finished by the powerful role of psychology of communication and identity, which doesn't just connect the first two, but turns them into something urgent and practical, a tool that can transform potential danger into real mastery. So, to make sense of this shift, we need a clear path through it. In this episode, we will move through three layers that build directly on one another. We will begin again by printing literacy and standardized language, not simply as a historical development, but as the moment communication became structured, one, stabilized, two, and scalable, three. This is where language stepped or stopped drifting and began organizing societies, institutions, and shared reality into a systemic way. From there on, we will move to the digital language encoding, not as a distant future, but as a present condition, a system that no longer just distributes meaning, but filters it, ranks it, and increasingly define what becomes visible, thinkable, and actionable in the first place. And finally, we will turn into the psychology of communication and identity because neither of these systems operates on its own. They become consequential only through the way individuals interpret them, analyze them, and build meaning, belonging, and identity within them. This is where the real question of this chapter begins. Not just how communication systems evolve, but how they shape what it means to think, to belong, and to act. By the end of this episode, these three topics will no longer appear as a separate subject. They will emerge as interconnected movement within a larger composition, one that is already being understood, interpreted, and shaped by those who are paying closest attention. If you ever had the sense that history is accelerating beyond the frameworks we've relied on, this episode is designed to help you to recalibrate your perspective. So, please stay with me until the end because the final insight, which we will discover in the psychology of communication and identity, are often where everything clicks into place. Not suddenly, but with a kind of quiet force that shifts how you see what is already in front of you. The kind of insight that makes you pause, reflect, and reconsider how you think, how you communicate, and how you engage with others. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Echoes of Change, Culture in Flux. Today is episode number 3. My name is Geraldine Nelly Bekono, Nelly for short. And indeed, at least part of global culture is in flux, as I usually say. Without further ado, let us dive into it.
Hear the heart calling. Every step echoes. We keep falling. Oh, we live.
Thank you, Nelly, for kicking this episode off. As you said, let us dive into it. Printing reorganized European civilization by aligning communication, coordination, and cultural encoding into a single, mechanically amplified system whose effects radiated into nearly every sphere of social life. With the arrival of movable type, the very ontology of text changed. What had once existed as a fragile, hand-copied manuscript, vulnerable to scribal error, slow transmission, and physical deterioration became a reproducible cultural artifact, standardized in its visual form, repeatable in its content, and capable of circulating across vast distances with an unprecedented degree of fidelity. The appearance of mechanical printing did not simply increase the number of books in the world. It reorganized the material conditions under which knowledge itself was produced, distributed, stabilized, and contested. Instead of drifting through scattered scriptoria, text then moved through a calibrated machine design to eliminate variation. This mechanization of reproduction restructured the way through which societies used to store memory, organized authority, and transmitted cultural meaning. This immense transformation unfolded along multiple fronts simultaneously, reinforcing itself through interlocking institutional and cultural shifts. Identical copies, suddenly available in volumes unimaginable to earlier eras, expanded literacy beyond clerical elites and undermined the manuscript tradition that had long monopolized textual interpretation. As printed books proliferated in towns, courts, universities, guilds, and later even in private homes, new readerships emerged: merchants, artisans, minor officials, educated women, and members of an increasingly urban middle class. The very act of engaging with text was democratized, and reading slowly became a social practice instead of a clerical privilege. At the same time, printing's insistence on uniformity stabilized emerging vernaculars. In regions where dialect continua had previously formed a patchwork of linguistic variation, consistent orthographies circulated through printed texts, giving shape to shared written standards that gradually anchored new national languages. What had once been oral or regional became textual, fixed, and collectively recognizable. The legal sphere underwent an equally profound reorientation. Law, previously dependent on local custom, oral interpretation, and the inevitable drift of handwritten manuscripts, grew increasingly public, inspectable, and uniform through printed legal codes. Citizens, magistrates, and jurists could now access identical versions of statutes, regulations, and commentaries, shifting law from a domain guarded by small interpretive elites to a system that aspired, at least in principle, to fixedness, transparency, and accountability. This was not merely a technical shift. It was a reconfiguration of the relationship between the government and the governed. Science, too, experienced a structural transformation as scholars pursued a culture of replication. Shared observation and empirical scrutiny, print offered reproducible formats that allowed experiments, diagrams, astronomical tables, anatomical drawings, and mathematical calculations to circulate with unprecedented consistency. Scholars separated by thousands of kilometers could now examine identical images, identical formulas, and identical descriptions of experimental procedures. This uniformity accelerated debate, stabilized emerging scientific methods, and increased the reliability of shared inquiry. Scientific communities, once localized, became trans-regional networks held together by print. Bureaucratic administration followed a parallel trajectory. States, municipalities, religious institutions, and commercial enterprises adopted print as an instrument for procedural regularity. Standard forms, official notices, fiscal records, and administrative inventories became tools of governance, allowing institutions to coordinate actions across wider territories and with greater internal coherence. Routine became standardized. Governance became more legible. The state became more textually organized. Yet the expansion of print was never frictionless. The very power of reproducibility, the ability of a single idea to multiply into thousands of identical copies, provoked intense efforts at control. Censorship regimes emerged, accompanied by licensing systems, official indexes of prohibited books, and legally enforced privileges granted to certain printers. These measures were not peripheral. They were attempts to contain the explosive potential of printed circulation, where texts could ignite theological conflict, political dissent, or intellectual fragmentation. Regulation grew in tandem with proliferation because print made ideas not only visible, but contagious. At the same time, print's expansion fostered new infrastructures of access. Public libraries, civic reading rooms, circulating collections, and academic repositories institutionalized the availability of books beyond the private domain. Reading became a civic act, and libraries became part of the public architecture of knowledge. Through these institutions, societies embedded print into the rhythms of everyday life, ensuring that its impact extended well beyond its commercial and professional circuits. Simultaneously, printing gave rise to a modern ecosystem of textual labor. A new professional class of authors, printers, editors, compositors, booksellers, and publishers emerged, transforming writing from a clerical duty into a secular occupation situated within expanding markets of readership and production. Authorship acquired legal recognition, commercial value and social identity. Intellectual work became organized, commodified, and increasingly independent from religious institutions. What began as a mechanical innovation matured into a durable social infrastructure that reshaped expectations about creativity, property, dissemination, and public discourse. Printing was therefore never merely a communication technology. It was a comprehensive civilizational reformatting, a transformation in how societies stored authority, stabilized language, coordinated knowledge, organized institutions, and negotiated power. The press altered not only what people read, but how they imagined their communities, how they conceptualized their institutions, and how they understood their own participation in the cultural, intellectual, and political worlds they inhabited. It created new publics, new authorities, new conflicts, and new possibilities, fundamentally reorienting the trajectory of human civilization. Before getting specific about the Gutenberg invention, let us take the time to look globally. How was it in other regions around the world when it comes to printing? In episode number 1, we touched a little bit on that. You can refer to it for starters, because there, we already mentioned that Gutenberg's invention was not the starting point of printing. Several regions around the world were already practicing some sort of printing, which naturally opened the door for a more industrial invention, which was then scaled up by Gutenberg in his time. So, before Gutenberg, East Asia had already pioneered woodblock printing and movable type, with Korea's early metal type offering a crucial technological precursor. Europe, however, possessed unique social and institutional conditions that allowed printing to scale rapidly once introduced. This segment frames Gutenberg not as an isolated inventor, but as the European culmination of a broader global trajectory. China. Repetition before disruption. Long before Europe developed movable type, China had already established a mature and highly sophisticated printing system based on woodblock technology. Instead of arranging individual letters, entire pages were carved in reverse into wooden blocks, inked, and then pressed onto paper. Once completed, a single carved block could reproduce the same page again and again with remarkable consistency. Printing became a system of mechanical repetition. One of the clearest examples appeared in the year 868 with the Diamond Sutra, discovered centuries later in a sealed cave at Dunhuang. It remains the oldest fully dated printed book known to exist. Its survival demonstrated something historically profound. Long before Gutenberg, text had already been mechanically stabilized and reproduced at scale. Through woodblock printing, Imperial China reproduced Buddhist scriptures, Confucian classics, civil service examination materials, administrative decrees, and official documents. Identical pages circulated across enormous territories. This allowed the state to standardize education, preserve doctrine, and maintain administrative coherence across the empire. But here lay the crucial distinction. In China, printing largely reinforced existing authority rather than disrupting it. The technology strengthened continuity instead of accelerating fragmentation. Mechanical reproduction existed, but it remained embedded within centralized political and cultural structures designed to preserve order. Printing coordinated society, yet it did not fundamentally destabilize the system that governed it. In this sense, China demonstrated that mechanical memory alone did not automatically produce social revolution. The effects of printing depended on the institutional environment into which the technology was introduced. In the 11th century, Bai Sheng introduced movable type made from baked clay. Characters could be rearranged and reused. The page became modular. This was the conceptual leap that underlies all later typography. Yet the scale problem was formidable. A logographic script demanded thousands of characters, imposing heavy burdens of storage, sorting, and retrieval. The innovation was real. The friction was structural. Centuries later, Wang Zhen refined movable type with rotating tables and methods for organizing characters, documented in the Gnome Shu. He addressed not only printing but typographic management and engineering sophistication that rationalized the workflow long before similar European developments. By the 13th century, Korea's Goryeo dynasty had produced the world's earliest movable metal type. This was around the year 1234, predating Gutenberg by more than 2 centuries. Metal type offered durability, precision, and reusability and supported the printing of Buddhist canons, government documents, and educational texts. Alongside it, the monumental Tripitaka Koreana, carved into more than 80,000 woodblocks, demonstrated a devotional print infrastructure of extraordinary scale. By the 13th century, East Asia had mass woodblock reproduction, movable type, metal casting, and institutional print networks. Technologically, the foundations were complete. So, why did this not erupt into civilizational rupture? The divergence between Asia and Europe emerges not from invention but from context, from the environments into which mechanical memory was introduced. Alphabetic systems, which required only a few dozen characters, made movable type composition efficient and cheap. Logographic systems, requiring thousands of distinct characters, multiplied the labor of casting, sorting, and composing. Movable type in an alphabet compressed work. Movable type in a logographic system expanded it. Institutional environments shaped outcomes just as powerfully. In China and Korea, printing served bureaucratic coherence and canonical continuity, strengthening the imperial center rather than destabilizing it. In much of the Islamic world, even as papermaking spread and manuscript culture flourished, mechanical printing in Arabic script faced sustained religious and administrative constraints. Across Eurasia, printing often reinforced authority. So that was the context in Asia, which was completely different in Europe. How was it then in Europe? By the 15th century, Europe had assembled the precise conditions that allowed printing not just to appear, but to accelerate. Universities expanded and required identical textbooks and commentaries. Urban literacy grew among merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats. Commercial capitalism intensified rivalry among cities. Political power was fragmented into jurisdictions with distinct markets and languages. Mediterranean paper mills made the substrate affordable. Block books and card printing had already normalized graphic repetition. Europe was not merely receptive. It was pressurized for print. The question was never whether printing would exist. The question was whether it would scale, and in Europe, it could only scale. Now, straight to Gutenberg's systemic convergence.
All right, thank you. But before jumping into Johannes Gutenberg's invention in Leipzig, I suggest that we take a small break and kind of digest everything that we have already presented until now. And with the break, we can also enjoy a piece of music, a piece of song, of course, that we prepared carefully for you for this episode. I think you already know that song if you have been following us for now, since the beginning for now. So please let us have a break and let us enjoy this music. And right after the music piece, we will come back and continue with Johannes Gutenberg's invention. Thank you. Bye.
We don't shrink the shape of thought or sand the edges of what we sought. Every silence carries meaning, even pauses still are speaking. Every word is given room to arrive uncut in full resume. We come as we already are, not rehearsed, not split apart. Time loosens its grip, the channel clears. No rewind, no preface here. You're not early, not late, not lost in road. You're present, you're here, you're whole. No say it whole, we let it land. No safety net, no shifting sand. If it's true, it earns a toll. If it matters, we let it grow. Oh, 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 no half-light, no control, no editing the soul mid-roll. This is presence, heart and mind in real time, undivided. We say it whole. What we question, we stay inside. We don't rush it just to decide. What we feel, we don't reduce or dress it up to make it smooth. Understanding takes its time. Depth unfolds, not outlined. We don't fear the longer way. Some answers breathe, they don't obey. Thoughts arrive, not compressed for speed, but shaped by care and honest need. What carries weight, we let it show. Depth is not excess, it's what we owe. If it moves us, let it move. No translating fire to soothe. We don't trade the real for. Don't rush it just to decide. What we feel, we don't reduce or dress it up to.
Okay, all right. Welcome back. I hope you could enjoy the piece of music. In case this is something that is interesting to you and you would like to listen to the whole song, just follow the links in the bio. Again, it is for free. No need to record any personal data. No need to give the names or to register with an email address. Just click on the link, enjoy the music, sit back on your sofa, and continue to enjoy your podcast. Without further ado, let us continue with Johannes Gutenberg's invention. By the way, again, today's episode is a little bit long. It is 3 chapters together, equally long. This is the first chapter. We still have 2 more chapters to come. In case you wanted to do something, I would suggest to put your audio, let's say, in your ears and just continue to do whatever you were doing. Whatever you were doing. But then, if you have time, who knows, for 2-3 hours, of course, we are pleased that you take all your time for us, and hopefully, this will also bring you something additional positively in your daily. Without losing more time, let us continue with Johannes Gutenberg's invention.
Naming things is how we trust. What we hide can't hold its ground. What is named becomes
Now, straight to Gutenberg's systemic convergence. In Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg forged a system by integrating technologies into a coherent machine. An adjustable mold for uniform letter casting, a durable lead, tin, antimony alloy, oil-based inks that bonded to metal, a screw press adapted from agricultural equipment. Individually, none was unprecedented. Together, they were transformative. Printing became mechanically repeatable. Mechanical memory became industrial. Europe acquired its first device capable of producing identical text at speed and scale. Once printing collided with Europe's structure, amplification followed instantly. Every force intensified the others. Alphabetic efficiency drove down labor and cost. Print multiplied. Universities demanded standardized texts. Printing synchronized scholarship across cities and accelerated intellectual exchange. Vernacular demand surged as populations sought texts in English, German, French, and Italian. Repetition introduced norms. Orthography stabilized. Grammar consolidated. Dialects converged. Language itself became mechanically disciplined. Religious tension met its multiplier. Luther's theses circulated with unprecedented velocity. Pamphlets multiplied. Vernacular Bibles proliferated. Doctrine escaped clerical containment. Print did not create dissent. It magnified it beyond institutional control. Commercial capitalism supplied distribution and incentive. Venice, Nuremberg, and Antwerp nurtured private print shops. book fairs, and merchant networks. Profit drove reproduction. Reproduction drove diffusion. Printing became unstoppable because it became profitable. Then arrived the institutional consolidation. By the late 15th and 16th centuries, printing matured into a settled system of practices, professions, and regulations, a durable institutional infrastructure. This means printing no longer looked like a handful of remarkable workshops. It looked like a coordinated industry with recognized roles, for example, type founders, compositors, correctors, editors, engravers, pressmen, which standardized workflows such as casting, composing, proofreading, imposing, printing, and binding. Aldus Manutius in Venice exemplified this maturity. Italic type and portable octavo formats were not mere aesthetic choices. They were professional strategies designed for a mobile republic of letters. William Caxton shows print as linguistic governance, repeatedly choosing spellings and forms that nudged English toward orthographic stability. The Plantin, Mauritius Press in Antwerp reveals printing as an information factory. Inventories, ledgers, timetables, teams, and international rights demonstrate industrial coordination at scale. When we say printing shifted from innovation to infrastructure, we mean it moved from disruptive novelty to a stable, socially embedded system, predictable, regulated, indispensable. It became the operating layer of European literacy and governance. On the other hand, though, printing stabilized the visual and textual foundations of science by making representations identical across copies. Before the press, hand-copied diagrams varied. After print, they did not. The Saliuses de Humani Corporis Fabrica during the year 1543 standardized anatomical images, so physicians could examine the same evidence. Copernicus's De Revolutionibus during the year 1543 standardized cosmological diagrams and tables so astronomers could compute from a common baseline. Verification became collective, criticism became cumulative, reproducibility became epistemic authority. Print did not replace observation, it synchronized it. Printing transformed Europe because it aligned three forces rarely synchronized: communication, the shift from scarcity to mechanical abundance. Identical texts moved across borders, creating shared horizons. Coordination, institutions synchronized through standard texts. Churches, universities, courts, bureaucracies, and movements mobilized at scale. Cultural encoding, laws, scientific diagrams, curricula, and archives became durable, inspectable, and cumulative across generations. Do you remember the trio we presented in the very first episode? So, when communication, coordination, and encoding converge, civilization does not merely evolve, it reconfigures itself. What did Gutenberg's invention concretely brought as a change? We call it Gutenberg's threshold as of the year 1450 onward. The Gutenberg threshold marks the moment in history when Europe crossed an irreversible civilizational boundary. It is the point at which the manuscript world, slow, fragile, expensive, and uneven, yielded to a regime structured around mechanical reproducibility. Under manuscript conditions, knowledge moved at the pace of the human hand. Text was copied line by line. Every manuscript bore the marks of local variation. Scribal error accumulated invisibly across generations. Books were rare objects, costly to produce and difficult to circulate. Meaning drifted as it traveled. Then the system changed. In Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg assembled a set of components that, taken together, transformed copying into manufacture. An adjustable hand mold. Movable type cast from a lead, tin, antimony alloy. A mechanically adapted screw press. Oil-based and capable of bonding to metal. Individually, none of these elements was unprecedented. Together, they constituted a new regime of textual production. For the first time in European history, it became possible to generate large numbers of high-fidelity, identical texts at speed. Reproducibility is not merely a technical achievement. It is a structural force. When identical copies travel across distance, they generate shared textual horizons, synchronized interpretive communities, stable reference frameworks for law, theology, and teaching, interregional intellectual networks anchored in uniform sources. At this threshold, Europe entered an information-dense environment unlike anything it had previously known. Why this system specifically triggered an explosion? The power of Gutenberg's system does not reside in the novelty of its parts. It resides in integration. Each element removed a bottleneck that had long constrained manuscript culture. Together, they dissolved the friction that had limited textual scale. The adjustable hand mold allowed thousands of letters to be cast with identical height, depth, and footprint. Interchangeability became the hidden geometry of the page. Typepieces could align with mechanical predictability. Books ceased to be artisanal exceptions. They became repeatable objects. This led to the lead, tin, antimony alloy. What did it solve as challenge? The alloy solved three interlocking problems: low melting point, meaning rapid casting cycles, sharp filling, meaning crisp, consistent letter forms, durability, meaning resistance to deformation across long press runs. Metal stopped being an obstacle and became a medium. The alloy is the metallurgical spine of mass reproducibility. Without it, the press would stall. With it, repetition became sustainable. It is important to not mix things up here and to be as clear as possible. Gutenberg did not invent the screw press. He repurposed it by adapting existing press technologies, originally used for olives and grapes. He created a mechanism capable of delivering uniform downward pressure across an entire form. This enabled consistent impressions, stable page geometry, increased throughput, reproducible additions across hundreds of sheets. Pressure became standardized. The page ceased to be subject to the variability of the human hand. Now, the crisis that happened as catalyst. On October 27, 1462, Mainz was sacked during an archiepiscopal conflict. Shops closed. Commerce collapsed. Artisans fled. Printers, many trained in the Fust Schaffer workshop, left carrying matrices, molds, press components, and something even more valuable: tacit knowledge embedded in muscle memory and practice skill. They re-established workshops in Cologne, Strasbourg, Basel, Rome, Venice, and beyond. But the sack of Mainz did not extinguish printing. It multiplied it. The Gutenberg threshold becomes historically consequential when reproducibility invades institutions. Within a decade, few domains show immediate transformation. First one, Fust and Schaffer printed Europe's first law book. Statutes that had once varied across manuscript copies became fixed across jurisdictions. Legal authority acquired typographic stability. Law became serial. Then, the first classical text printed north of the Alps, De Officia signaled that humanist scholarship was leaving manuscript exclusivity behind. Classical authority entered the typographic domain. Reproducibility migrated into law, religion, and classical learning. The threshold became institutional. After the Mainz diaspora, German printers established Italy's first press at Subiaco in 1465, which brings us to the first Italian press and early internationalization. Diffusion no longer traveled only through books, but through highly skilled labor migration. From Subiaco, printing moved to Rome, and then Venice. Workshops multiplied. Operators trained apprentices. Knowledge standardized across borders. Mechanical reproducibility now moved through bodies as well as pages. Europe's first transcontinental network of press operators emerged. By the early 460s, the Frankfurt Book Fair had begun functioning as the principal marketplace for sheet sales, rights negotiations, catalog distribution, cross-regional inventory coordination. Mechanical reproducibility required logistics. A continental coordination node formed almost immediately. The book became not only a text, but a tradable commodity moving through structured channels of exchange. With that being said, let us comedy to our triad again and see exactly what Gutenberg's threshold changed in it. Number 1, communication. Meaning must move from one mind to another. Identical copies suppress local textual variants. Printed Bibles and Ciceronian texts circulate as stable semantic objects. Meaning travels intact. Number 2, coordination. After meaning is collectively shared, then coordinated action is at least thinkable. Uniform statutes, standardized liturgy, and centralized book markets synchronize communities across regions. Frankfurt becomes a coordination hub. Communities align around the same words. Number 3, cultural encoding. Finally, knowledge must be documented and preserved, so it can last beyond the present moment. Print produces cumulative archives. Editions correct one another. New formats refine design. Communities stabilize around persistent reference points. The shift from the 42-line to the 48-line Bible demonstrates iterative improvement within a shared textual framework. Memory becomes auditable. All 3 forces now reinforce one another. The threshold is crossed not when a book is printed, but when communication, coordination, and encoding begin to amplify each other. An example which we situated in Mainz during the year 1457. Fust and Schaffer closed the Forum of the Psalter. The press descends. Wood strains. Metal holds. Ink transfers. When the platen rises, red and blue initials align perfectly with black text, the first mechanically printed color in European history. The colophon declares names and date. Printing announces itself publicly. 2 years later, Mainz burns. Printers leave carrying matrices and molds, the true capital of the new industry, and rebuild in Cologne, Strasbourg, Basel, and Italy. By 1465, German printers established the first Italian press in Subiaco. By the same year, Cicero appears in standardized typographic form north of the Alps. In Frankfurt, merchants coordinate sheets and rights as commercial goods. Reproducibility has acquired its market. Europe has crossed the threshold. Now, let us look at universities as demand engines between the 12th and 15th centuries, how pre-existing scholastic networks primed the press for immediate uptake. Universities did not merely benefit from printing. They constituted the pre-existing market, logistics, and quality assurance system that made typographic standardization economically viable from day one. By the mid-15th century, Europe's academic infrastructure had already converged on a regime that demanded many copies, identical copies, reliable copies, conditions that manuscript production could only approximate. The press met a latent structural demand that centuries of scholastic growth had made visible. From the early 13th century, the Pichia system reorganized manuscript reproduction in major university towns like Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Naples, dividing an authorized exemplar into numbered quires that multiple copyists rented, copied, and returned in rotation. An elegant attempt to scale production while policing textual accuracy. Surviving evidence ranges from the Vercelli contract of the year 1228 to extensive codicological traces across Paris and Bologna. The system entailed licensed stationers, university oversight, and officials who certified corrigenda against the exemplar, a medieval quality control pipeline that prefigured the press room's editorial departments. Scholars have documented Piscia's breadth and mechanics in detail. It spread across at least 11 universities, its reliance on exemplaria vera et correcta, and its alignment with scholastic needs for rapid dissemination of teaching texts. The system's very success clarified its limits: cost, speed, and accumulating variance. When print arrived, the Piscia economy was structurally obsolete within decades. Typographic editions did what Piscia promised, but faster, cheaper, and identically. Long before the press, universities, especially Paris, had statutory frameworks to regulate academic life, licensing, teaching schedules, and indirectly the book trade through recognized stationers and approved exemplars. Papal and Parisian statutes, for example, Gregory IX statutes in the year 1231 formalized the university's jurisdiction over training, examinations, and standards. Bologna's law faculty specified even line counts and letter counts per column for exemplars, an extraordinary pursuit of format regularity in a manuscript world. Such measures reveal a centuries-old administrative desire for textual fixity that printing delivered as routine. The scholastic book economy employed correctors petiarii, university-appointed specialists who compared copies to the exemplar, certified accuracy, and sanctioned dissemination, functional ancestors of the compositor, proofreader, editor triad of the print shop. Their work demonstrates how textual fidelity was already institutionalized in universities, rendering the transition to typographic edition-based teaching almost frictionless. Still, no discipline better exposes the volume and standardization imperatives than law. Bologna's faculties in Roman and canon law consumed and reproduced pivotal juridical corpora. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis and Gratian's Decretum around the year 1140, with the latter anchoring the teaching and systematization of canon law across Europe. The law school statutes specified curricular coverage and even regulated professors. Calendars, a regime oriented toward repeatable teaching from stable texts, which printing would soon provide in uniform editions. Gratian's Decretum became not just a text, but a platform for commentary and gloss, a scholastic architecture whose interpretive integrity depended on consistent readings, precisely what typographic reproduction stabilized later. By the year 1500, over 80 universities had been established in Western and Central Europe, while the 14th and 15th centuries witnessed an accelerated founding wave of new institutions across the continent. This expansion was not abstract. It produced renewing cohorts of students, annual curricular cycles, and expanding libraries, all of which guaranteed recurring consumption of key texts. The press arrived into an academic marketplace that was already continent-spanning and demographically primed. The prestige of the earliest centers in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford remained a gravitational force, setting standards for newer foundations and ensuring inter-university textual interoperability, a condition that typographic editions would soon formalize. Universities formed a pan-European labor and knowledge market. The right to teach anywhere and the legal category of the study recognized the portability of degrees and licensing, enabling scholars to move across jurisdictions with minimal friction. Pope Gregory IX's bulls for Toulouse in the year 1233 exemplify papal interventions that normalized academic mobility. Such human circulation doubled as a distribution system for books. Once printed, editions moved through the same corridors that manuscripts had long traversed. Now, the Black Death, a shock that tightened the textual bottleneck. The Black Death between the year 1347 and 1353 devastated European populations, producing sustained labor scarcity and pronounced wage effects. In the book economy, this meant fewer skilled scribes and higher copy costs just as student demand and institutional proliferation persisted. Quantitative studies consistently link the plague to rising wages and long-run structural changes. In the manuscript sector, labor accounted for the overwhelming share of costs, amplifying price pressures. Printing's cost structure, front-loaded capital with low marginal costs, directly exploited the post-plague economy. Price and cost studies of English manuscripts between 300 and 1,483 show labor often constituted 80% of a manuscript's cost base, and that plague-era shortages drove prices upward, precisely the environment in which the economies of scale of print would outcompete script. Within decades of the year 1450, printers could supply multiple, identical copies at per-unit prices that eroded the rationale for piecea rentals and professional copying. By 1500, Europe had produced millions of printed books, a transformation that dwarfed the manuscript era's cumulative output and normalized paper, format regularity, and edition-based pedagogy. University towns, already book markets, flipped to print almost by default. Fast forward, literacy expansion, and the rise of textual publics, books become affordable. Reading becomes a mass skill. Interpretive authority redistributes. The decisive fact of the late 15th century is not simply that Europe gained a new machine. It is that identical texts began to circulate in quantities and at prices that collapsed older barriers to entry into literate culture. Within roughly 50 years of Gutenberg, the European book world moved from a manuscript economy counted in thousands to a print ecology exceeding 9 million copies, a step change in availability that no institution could ignore. This rise hinged on the press's cost logic. Capital-intensive setup offset by falling marginal cost across longer print runs, so that the unit price of books dropped relative to wages and staples, a pattern now visible in surviving incarnable price notes and comparative cost of living reconstructions built from large corpora of 15th century books. The press's productive ceiling dwarfed hand reproduction. Contemporary reconstructions put workday output of a well-run 15th century press in the order of 600 pages per day, versus dozens by older hand impression methods and only a handful by scribes, quantifying the mechanical advantage that underwrote lower prices. Just as consequential was geographical saturation. By the year 1500, presses were operating in more than 250 European cities, multiplying points of access and retail. Between the year 1500 and 1800, Western Europe traversed an uneven path from restricted to mass literacy. In this process, literacy did not arrive as a single threshold but as a spectrum of competences, from decoding aloud with partial comprehension to fast, silent, interiorized reading that permitted cross-referencing and private judgment. The cultural historians of reading have long noted that the privatization of reading, its move from performance to interiority, accumulated over centuries. Mastered first in monastic scriptoria, then by university scholars in the 12th century, by lay elites later, and only broadly diffused by the 15th century, as print multiplied reasons and occasions to read in solitude. Yet communal and performative practices remained powerful. Early modern publics still gathered around read-aloud occasions in households, workshops, taverns, parishes, so that text functioned simultaneously as sound and silent page. That hybridity also shaped learned worlds. The Royal Society, for example, built discussion precisely on texts being read aloud, then edited, printed, and circulated, formatting a recursive circuit from voice to page and back to voice that drew in listeners who were not yet silent readers. What print altered, therefore, was not only how many people could read, but how reading practices layered, allowing semi-literate and literate publics to coexist and interact within the same textual economy. If codices and octavos constituted the durable backbone of print culture, the ephemera, broadsheets, pamphlets, ballads, single-sheet ordinances were its capillaries, the point of first contact for semi-literate audiences. Recent collaborative work on single-sheet publishing reconstructs not only their genres, but also their production volumes and economics, showing how they underpinned a business model that could afford to sell cheaply and widely. Print-run evidence is striking. The case of 50,000 Veronicas demonstrates devotional sheets produced at tens of thousands of copies in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a scale that would have been unimaginable in manuscript and that placed printed artifacts in hands far from universities and courts. These forms also anchored civic literacy. Municipal authorities printed ordinances and market notices as broadsheets, using cheap print to make governance legible, public, and through posting and reading aloud, audible to non-readers. And because single sheets were visual, combining woodcuts, large type, and simple layouts, they functioned as proto-literacy tools, bridging image and word for audiences still traversing the alphabetic threshold. Woodcut printing on paper, documented, had already trained viewers to decode images and captions. Print simply folded that visual literacy into an alphabetic regime. The twice-yearly Frankfurt and Leipzig book fairs provided the early modern distribution grid for Europe's expanding readership. From the year 1560, Frankfurt Fair catalogs compiled and circulated the total stock of new books since the last fair. Effectively the first periodic international bibliographies, prototypes of modern books in print, that flattened information asymmetries for remote booksellers, scholars, and lay buyers. These catalogs were cooperative instruments. Visiting printers submitted title pages in advance so the lists could be arranged by subject and issued in time to disseminate to clients who did not attend in person. Subsequent digitizations of Frankfurt and Leipzig catalogs now allow us to track categories, offerings, and the seasonal cadence by which new texts entered the European marketplace of reading. Long before Luther, late medieval readers encountered vernacular Bibles in print. German editions appeared in multiple printings during the 15th century, showing that lay scriptural demand predated the Reformation. What the 16th century did was to massify and politicize that lay encounter. Wittenberg's presses, energized by Luther's short, lucid vernacular forms and by Lucas Cranach's design discipline, produced an estimated 2,721 works between 1,517 and 1,546, roughly 91 per year, totaling about 3 million copies, and turned the pamphlet into an instrument for forging publics that could receive, rehearse, and recirculate doctrine. Contemporary observers and later scholarship concur that these Flugschriften, flying writings, were designed for speed, concealability, and impact, saturating German cities and beyond with affordable reform and counter-reform literature. Catholic policy toward vernacular Bibles before Trent, however, was regionally differentiated, relatively permissive in parts of the Empire, Low Countries, Italy, Bohemia, and Poland. Restrictive in Spain and England, where authorities associated vernacular scripture with heterodox movements, and more restrictive in France, as evangelical currents intensified in the year 1520s. Crucially, the efficacy of prohibitions varied. Lay Bible reading often persisted where distribution networks were robust. The new print economy entered households and reshaped domestic literacy. Major aggregations of women's marginalia now document thousands of instances of female ownership and annotation across genres, not just devotion, but also history, philosophy, drama, and practical literature, revising older assumptions about women as narrowly devotional readers. Projects dedicated to early modern women's marks on books, spanning 100-plus archives, show signatures, summaries, correction marks, arithmetic, drawings, and memoranda. A material archive of interpretation that locates hermeneutic labor in kitchens, parlors, and convent cells as much as in lecture halls. Literacy's ascent was asynchronous. the Netherlands and England registered earlier gains, approaching or exceeding 50% adult literacy by the mid-17th century, while other regions rose more slowly until the 18th century nexus of Enlightenment reforms and early industrialization. These trajectories correlate with institutional changes, such as property rights, market institutions, and municipal schooling, that created incentives to invest in basic reading and numeracy. Meanwhile, in places like Elizabethan England, a patchwork of preparatory and grammar schools, private tuition, and some free school foundations widened access, even as gender and class constraints persisted. The crucial driver remained the availability of printed pedagogical tools, such as primers, catechisms, and grammars at falling prices. Now, from readers to publics, from publics to authority shifts. The convergence of affordability, distribution, and layered practices produced not only more readers, but textual publics, aggregations of people who, though they never met, could orient themselves to the same editions, same pamphlets, same broadsheets, and same catalogs, and thus participate in shared horizons of meaning. In such a world, interpretive authority could no longer be monopolized by clerical homily or the university lectern. Pamphlet cycles framed controversies for lay judgment. Broadsheet ordinances made the law legible to the street. Household Bibles migrated exegesis into domestic conversation, and fair catalogs enabled provincial readers to follow metropolitan debates. Crucially, visuality persisted as a democratizing force. Woodcuts and emblematic pages scaffold understanding for semi-literate publics, while communal reading, still widespread, turned the literate few into multipliers for the many. Institutions responded with imprimaturs, indexes, censorship edicts, catechetical programs, and standardized schooling, all tacit acknowledgments that textual interpretation had redistributed outward and downward. Books became affordable. Reading became a mass skill. Even when layered through image and voice, interpretive authority redistributed. That triad is not a slogan, but the observed structure of Europe's first text-saturated public life. After the Rising period, standardizing vernaculars, weakening Latin. Printers, textbooks, and Bibles forged national languages. Print's first linguistic achievement was to discipline variation. A compositor could not set a page in 6 spellings at once. Editions forced choices in orthography, lexicon, and syntax that, when replicated and adopted by schools and courts, stabilized written language. The schoolroom's grammar canon, above all Aelius Donatus's Ars Minor, moved from manuscript into hundreds of 15th century editions, some printed with Gutenberg's very types and later recovered as binding waste, hard evidence that grammatical pedagogy scaled through print and trained readers in repeatable forms. Equally decisive was the codification of vernaculars by grammars and Bibles. In year 1492, Antonio de Nebrija published the first printed grammar of a modern European language, the Grammatica de la Lingua Castellana, organizing Castilian into orthography, prosody, etymology, diction, syntax, and a 5th book for foreigners. Nebrija's preface to Queen Isabella is explicit. Language is an instrument of rule. Standardizing Castilian would serve administration and empire. He wrote a vernacular grammar to teach Latin better, yes, but also to fix the vernacular's rules so they could carry law and culture. Standardization radiated through textbook ecologies and portable formats. In Venice, Aldus Manutius re-engineered reading with Octavo, pocket classics, and humanist typefaces, making Greek and Latin authors and, by extension, vernaculars informed by them, portable and private in ways that intensified silent, individualized habits of reading and widened distribution beyond cloisters and courts. The institutional drift away from Latin then consolidated the shift. As municipal ordinances, court formularies, and university notices appeared in vernacular print, and as broadsheet civic postings were read aloud in marketplaces, Latin lost ground in everyday administration. In short, communication via identical vernacular prints habituated readers. Coordination followed as schools and courts conformed to those prints, and encoding matured into national written standards that carried law, faith, and culture. Print generated markets for writing. Almanacs, manuals, grammars, devotional tracts, plays, news, and scholarly editions. In Venice, Aldous collaborated with humanists to deliver authoritatively edited texts in handy formats, aligning editorial credibility with commercial design. In Germany, Luther learned to play format, paratext, and distribution like an instrument, becoming arguably the first mass media author whose name itself signaled a reliable product. The Fair Catalog system then stitched these markets together. From 1564, Frankfurt Fair catalogs provided semi-annual, pan-European bibliographies, enabling remote booksellers and readers to discover what existed, where, and by whom, a periodic books in print long before the modern ISBN universe. Such catalogs registered authorship and stabilized reputational capital across borders. They also let printers compare and compete on identical listings. Thus, communication expanded audiences, coordination emerged as predictable cycles of production, sales, and reprint, and encoding solidified authorial identity and backlists as persistent market signals. Now to censorship, licensing, and indexes.
All right, dear listeners, I think it is greatly time for another break because this is a lot of information, a lot of input to digest. I don't know if you feel like me, but for me, in any case, this is really a lot of information for me to digest. So for that reason, I propose that we have a small break during which we can also enjoy again another piece of music. This one was launched with episode number 2 when we talked about oral communication, for example, the Vedic recitation or the West African griot. If you haven't listened to the second episode, I greatly encourage you to go and listen to episode number 2 of Echoes of Change Culture in Flux. And also, again, the soundtracks, everything is in the bio. Simply follow the link, and then you have and there you have access to the whole songs. So without losing more time, let us have a break. Let us enjoy this song, and after the break we will continue. So enjoy.
I kept it in my mouth like a coin too cold to spend. You said say it clean, so I said it once again. The first shape changes when hands keep passing it along, but the cut on the edge still tells me where it went wrong. Soft, then corrected, then softer still. We learn the line by bending to it. Form of memory, hold it with me. Men and women sing, but the ears can't keep. Form of memory, tell it gently, hold it with me. Truth stays when we breathe. A name on paper fades, but the mouth remembers wait. Every careful answer is a door that learns to wait. What was We learn the line by bending to a form of memory. Hold it with me. Men and women sing what the years can't keep. Form of memory. Tell it gently. Hold it with me. Truth stays when we breathe. If I miss one word, will the meaning break?
All right, welcome back after this small and quick break. I hope you guys enjoyed the music. Actually, it would be interesting to know what you think about all the song, all the music that we play here in related to this project. Do they help you to digest the input? Do they help you to think about the topics we are having here? Or are they annoying and you just want to listen to something else, or just listen to the podcast input itself without any music? It would be interesting to know what you think about it, because let's assume that you find it annoying. It would be a smart move for me to remove them, right? Because I don't want to upset you. I want you to feel at ease as far as possible while listening to the podcast. Or are you actually enjoying them? Because then it will also be a smart move to continue to provide this music, these soundtracks, and let's say that your feedback is really, really wished and welcome. Yeah. So before we continue, again, a kind reminder that today's episode is actually long. Again, like we have 3 chapters, and this is only the first chapter, and we are already over 1 hour. What I am going to do to help us all digest all of this is that I am going to dissect the whole episode into 3 different episodes: chapter number 1, number 2, and the third chapter. And of course, the whole episode will also be dropped at once, which will be like 3.5 hours. In case you have 1 hour, you can listen to the first chapter, and then the second hour you can listen to the second one and the third one. Or who knows, maybe you have 4 hours and you can listen to the whole thing at once. In any case, everything will be provided. Again, you can find the video version of it on YouTube and Rumble. The video version is usually a little bit more condensed, like maximum 1 hour, 1 hour and 10 minutes. For those who prefer Rumble, it is also there. It will also be dropped there on Rumble. For those who prefer to read, as usual, the written article can be found on my LinkedIn page or X. In any case, it is there, and you can just go and enjoy the article. It is still free for now, but let's say that with the time, indeed, I plan to make, let's say, on a subscription basis, because the research, the publication are actually, let's say, it's not easy, or it's not cheap. So this is why for the reading, for the article, the newsletter, I will introduce a subscription basis on that. Without losing more time, without further ado, please let us jump into the end of this chapter before we can move to chapter 2 and 3rd. And hopefully you will continue to listen to the 2 others chapter. Okay, enjoy.
Now to censorship, licensing, and indexes. As print accelerated diffusion, authorities built pre-publication licensing and post-publication sanctions. On the Catholic side, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum formalized bans on heterodox or immoral works and set rules for licensing and suppression. The index evolved until 1966, shaping reading long after the 16th century. In England, the Licensing of the Press Act in Year 1, 662 revived and consolidated earlier Star Chamber press controls, notably 1586 and 1637, empowered the Stationers' Company and appointed agents such as Roger Lestrange to search premises and seize unlicensed presses. The act is pivotal not only for censorship, but for economics. It tied protection of trade monopolies to licensing, revealing how information governance intertwined with market power. Crucially, the Act also instituted legal deposit, the practice of depositing copies in specified libraries, which bound censorship to preservation and knowledge organization. After 1679, and definitively after 1695, pre-publication licensing lapsed, and authorities relied on ex post prosecutions for libel and sedition, prompting printers to jurisdiction shop, producing English books abroad to evade the Act during its terms. The index's breadth is also a reminder of scope. Beyond theologians, the lists at various moments encompass Descartes, Pascal, Rousseau, Voltaire, Kant, Flaubert, Zola, and others, underscoring that the battle concerned epistemic authority across science, philosophy, literature, and even dictionaries. So, in this domain, communication was channeled by licensing, coordination enforced through guilds and crown church alliances, and encoding extended to bureaucratic paratext, imprimaturs, privileges, and indices that marked a text's legitimacy or danger. From monasteries to civic repositories of knowledge, print outgrew monastic custody. New civic and university libraries arose to store, catalog, and furnish access to proliferating books. The Bodleian Library, in Oxford in year 1602, is exemplary. In 3 years, it expanded from 2,000 books at opening to 8,700 volumes in the 1605 catalog, effectively serving as a de facto national library for England. Early on, Bodley secured arrangements with the Stationers' Company, later fortified by law, to receive free copies, the embryo of modern legal deposit that preserved the national imprint. These features mark an institutional commitment to public knowledge and long-term memory. Across Europe, civic and court libraries, the Bibliothèque du Roi in France, Venice's Marciana, and many German city libraries assumed parallel roles. They were not bookstores. They were memory machines. They cataloged, preserved, and made discoverable the record of print. That is, they turned communication surges into coordinated infrastructures and encoded those surges into national cultural memory. Cue synthesis in your triad. Printing as the epoch where communication, coordination, and encoding briefly align, and why later digital media unbundle them. If manuscript culture offered slow communication, local coordination, and fragile encoding, and digital media provide hypercommunication, volatile coordination, and fluid encoding, print alone achieved the rare alignment of all three. Communication. Identical pages traveling through fair catalogs and journal routines, for example, philosophical transactions, standardized how ideas were registered, verified, disseminated, archived. Coordination movements synchronized via pamphlets, law harmonized through statutes and ordinances, science replicated via reproducible figures and report genres. Markets converged around periodic listings and predictable cycles. Encoding, grammars, dictionaries, codes, atlases, indices, catalogs, and libraries stored the civilization's memory and made it citable across generations. In closing of this circle, pre-Luther vernacular Bibles, Aldine portability, and Devotio Modernis seeded linguistic and devotional habits. Jean Van Study features and Dutch states ordinances normalized vernacular textual authority. Vesalian precursors and Oldenburg's journal functions fixed scientific method. Index bands and stationers' controls managed the spillover. The Bodleians' legal deposit turned secure the archive. Together, they show why printing made nations, public law, cumulative science, authorship markets, control regimes, and memory institutions, because only print fused communication, coordination, and encoding into a single, durable social machine. The story of printing is not only one of mechanical reproduction and intellectual democratization, it is also a story of emotional, cultural, and institutional reorientation. When identical books began to circulate across cities, courts, markets, monasteries, workshops, and households, Europe encountered a new symbolic experience: the stability of the page. For the first time, people could return to a text confident that it would be the same text others were reading elsewhere. This engendered a new form of textual trust, a belief that knowledge could be fixed, verified, and shared.
All right. Thank you. So we are at the end of chapter 1 of the episode number 3 of Echoes of Change Culture Influx. This is a lot of input again. I know it is not always easy to digest all of that, but hey, here we are and trying our best to make it, let's say, digestible. Now we are going to move without losing any second. We are going to move to chapter number 2, which is also equally long. Let's say you have to plan for it at least 1 hour, to say the least. And then we will finish with chapter number 2. Chapter number 3, pardon me. And then chapter number 2 is about digital language, like the digital language and coding. And the chapter number 3, we go a little bit more into psychology of communication and identity. Spoiler alert, I am not a psychologist. Let's say that. It is also, again, a tool that I had to dig into for me to understand some more what I was researching. But hey, this is still far away. We have to first go through the digital language and coding, and this will be our chapter number 2. So see you into chapter number 2, or speaking to you into chapter number 2. Enjoy.